Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. On October 2nd, 2019, the media published a 4-page letter written by Chris Watts from Dodge Correctional, dated April 23rd, 2019. On page 3 of the 4-page letter, in a section numbered number 3, Watts writes, and I quote, "The reason the medical examiner found OxyContin in Shan'ann's system is because I gave it to her." So in a way, I wasn't surprised to see that, simply because True Crime Rocket Science had covered it in a blog post dated January 13th, 2019. I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't come across the Google search myself going through the discovery. I'm also embarrassed to say that this blog post was only published January 13th, so 2 long months after the discovery was published. How I became aware of the reference to OxyContin or oxycodone, whichever way you want to put it, was someone that actually left a comment on the Crime Rocket blog, and I then realized, wow, I hadn't seen this before. What is strange though is I did do a thorough search of the document for the term delete or deleted, and the strange thing is the Google search for it's oxycodone without the E, so it's 80 milligrams oxycodone but without the E. It's not clear whether that was a misspelling or whether it cut off because of, that was just the amount, the section of the word that was referenced in the search. In any event, when you do a Google search, there's not much in the discovery actually regarding that particular search. There's no reference to it. In other words, there's no reference in the discovery to oxy or oxycodone or anything like that. And when you search for the word delete, even though the terms that are referenced, including the how to delete your Instagram account, even though they are referenced, it's not sort of very closely associated with the word delete. There are, in fact, let's just quickly do a search for the word delete. The word delete comes up 48, sorry, it's still counting, 65 times in the discovery, but a lot of these references are from the signatures to emails, saying, for example, so let's just get there. Please notify the sender by electronic mail or otherwise and delete the original message. This is the signature message from a lot of the emails that are quoted in the discovery. So a lot of these references to delete are irrelevant. And then you have a couple of references in the data review where delete is mentioned regarding specific items that have been retrieved. That's more relevant, but there's no mention of delete and oxycodone or oxycontin. It's simply one sort of sentence or one strip of code on page 1769 of the discovery. So it's very late in the discovery and it's very easy to miss. So what I was interested in looking at, let me just correct myself just in terms of oxycodone does come up in terms of the compounds checked for in terms of the autopsy. And there it refers to oxycodone and oxymorphone. And there are 15 references to it. Some of these are not strictly for oxycodone. Some of them are like the full word for, say, DNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid. So that's also reference to oxy, but not oxycodone. An oxygenated volatiles panel, that's also mentioned in the pathology. But the point is that oxycodone isn't mentioned as anything that was searched for, other than that one little string of code, which is basically invisible. So the fact that the discovery doesn't acknowledge it itself is strange. One wonders whether that is an oversight or whether that is sort of hidden in plain sight. So as I say, when I came across this reference in the letter Watts wrote, it wasn't a complete surprise. I've been researching a book called Silver Fox, which is a brand new series on the Watts case, dealing specifically with Chris Watts, not really dealing with a lot of the other people, but dealing with him and his versions and the kind of person that he is and his psychology. And one thing that I wanted to verify was when I had referred to oxycodone or the idea of sedation for the first time through the course of the 9 narratives of the previous series, which was the Two-Phase series. You might think that when you write a book that you can remember every single book as a distinctive whole, but when you write a trilogy and they sort of evolve and one book is sort of in a way derived from the other or built on the platform of the previous book, they in the mind of the writer they sort of wash together in a way. So I couldn't actually remember when was the first time I'd referred to the idea of sedation, but I was very sure that I'd referred to Casey Anthony and that whole intertextual aspect. But I thought I would just check, and that's what I want to share with you in this particular post. The first reference to the idea of a sedative was in the very first narrative, published on September 10th, 2018. It was actually in the very last chapter of the first narrative, and I basically put quite a long scenario together. I'm only going to refer to a short aspect of it here. Now I know that there are a lot of people who feel that they are experts on this case. It's probably best if you don't listen any further because you the experts. So, go and be expert somewhere else, kind of thing. The position of true crime rocket science is that you never know everything, but you do try your best to find out. It's also the position of true crime rocket science that we feel it's possible to know a lot. I want to say that it's possible to know everything, but that's not possible. But I want to say that the idea of knowing what I guess, is sufficient, knowing a great deal, if one simply puts in enough effort and concentration and focus and, you know, settles down to read the work and do the work, then you are going to get a lot of answers. So with that in mind, the position of true crime rocket science in the very first narrative, as I say, this was in September, well before the release of the discovery, and obviously months and months before I even came across the oxycodone. I suspected there would be something like that, but I didn't know for sure. And the whole lupus painkiller thing was definitely pointing in that direction all along. There are other things that were also pointing in that direction, but I won't go into that now. I guess the revelation that might be news to people who don't know this channel or don't know my work or don't know True Crime Rocket Science is that Bella and Celeste were murdered with oxycodone, not Shan'ann. In other words, their death wasn't by smothering, although it's possible they were smothered afterwards. I just don't believe it personally. But yeah, so it's the position of True Crime Rocket Science that the oxycodone was used on the children, not on Shan'ann. Now, obviously, I know there are hordes out there saying, but that's not what Chris Watts said. Chris Watts said that he blah blah blah. That's such a tired argument by now. That's also something that comes across over and over again in true crime. Is someone will say, but that's not what the murderer said. Yeah, it's not. It's not what the murderer said. The murderer said X, and if you want to believe him, that's your business. Rocket science isn't about believing what a murderer says. It's about interpreting the evidence and also anchoring some of that to some of what is said by these perpetrators. Not all of it is lies, but certainly very little of it is truth, and that's the tricky part. Is a little bit of it is truth. What is the truth? It seems that most people sort of say, "Oh, the first version, that's the truth." Then he comes up with a second confession. "Oh, that's the truth. The whole thing is true." Then the next version comes. "Oh no, that whole version is true." And it's never like that. All of it is sort of muddy and murky, and all of it is somewhat true and somewhat not true, and mostly not true. So I want to go into this hypothesis in further detail, that Bella and Celeste were murdered with oxy. Why I say this, why it's reinforced by the discovery, why it makes sense, and also the intertextual aspects. For those who want to just get a more factual basis for this, you're welcome to read the link that goes to the blog, which references page 1769 of the discovery. I must say, when I saw that reference, it was basically like a light going on in my brain. I obviously can't prove it, but when I saw that, I thought, there's your murder weapon. Just because it's a very idiosyncratic thing, and it also matches the behavior of Chris Watts, where he buries everything in plain sight. So you've got pain medication in the house. You don't need to go and find a murder weapon. You just need to Google the pharmacodynamics of it, which he did. Anyway, I know people will argue with that, and that's fine. For the rest, let me just go through the last chapter. There's an excerpt from the last chapter of the very first book. Again, it's a long chapter, so I'm only going to read about a quarter of it. Here we go. In Chris Watts's own version of events, the girls were killed first and then Shan'ann. Now, this is obviously referring to the affidavit, which was released in August. So this is the version of events that this is referring to. The order of deaths is thus not a matter of dispute. What is a matter of dispute is how long before Shan'ann's death were Bella and Celeste killed. Now you can remember that in Watts's first version, the version was that Shan'ann killed Bella while he was not in the room, and then she killed Celeste, and then Shan'ann sort of he caught sort of Shan'ann in while she was doing it. So what I think is very sort of strange is this idea that it takes 3 to 5 minutes to strangle one person. So this whole idea that Watts sort of left the room, was on his way downstairs, and then turned around because he heard something and then went back upstairs. And it's almost like in that little tiny space of time, in a tiny corridor of time, Shan'ann is able to strangle 2 children to death, or even just one, if you want to look at it that way. 3 to 5 minutes is a really long time. And in Watts's version, it's almost like he makes a U-turn on the staircase and then sort of rushes back into the room. This actually shows that he didn't know how long it would take to strangle a person, specifically the children. So his version doesn't actually add up, and I think that's quite significant. Going back to the narrative, the affidavit stipulates that the 2 little girls were murdered by their father on or between 12 to 13 August, which opens up the possibility that they may have been killed several hours before Shan'ann returned home from Arizona. Now, this was the position of the authorities early on, and I agreed with it at that stage, and I've actually agreed with it ever since. I felt that it would make sense in a premeditated murder to sort things out when the situation was simple. In other words, when Shan'ann, who would be like a lioness around her children, if this was Watts's plan, you wouldn't want to do it with a lioness around, especially since Shan'ann really was a fearsome presence to confront, to have to fight, and Watts didn't want to fight with her, he didn't want to confront her. So I've always felt that really made sense, that he would have done that early on. Of course, the argument that a lot of people have had is, if he killed the children, Shan'ann got home, she could have seen the children, and then you would have had a really bad situation. True, but if Watts was already committed to his plan, then he was going to kill Shan'ann anyway. It wasn't going to be, well, maybe not. So you can argue that one both ways. You can also argue that if you want to take Chris Watts's version, then you're talking about a situation where everyone died simultaneously. The question is, did they? And there's a very simple way to debunk that. Very, very simple. Once again, one's got to choose what to believe from what Chris Watts is saying. If you're saying everything isn't true, then you can't debunk it, but then why are you accepting that everyone died simultaneously, which is also his version? So again, this requires the sort of genius and rocket science ability to tell the difference between the criminal leaking something that's anchored in reality and the stuff that's nonsense. It does take someone who's got experience in deciphering the difference between that. Now, the charging documents said that, gave as an explanation that Watts went into a fit of rage, strangled Shan'ann to death immediately after he saw on the baby monitor Shan'ann actively strangling Celeste. Bella, Watts told the authorities, was already dead and had started turning blue. he claimed Shan'ann killed the kids as revenge after he told her he wanted a separation. So this story makes sense if you don't actually imagine it. So if you don't actually imagine Watt saying to his wife, I want a separation, she then sort of goes to another room, and then he's in another room, and this is early in the morning when there's quite a lot of activity. You're preparing to go to work, you getting dressed, you actively moving around the rooms. This is in an innocent scenario, and now at least 6 to 10 minutes have got to go by in order to strangle two people to death. It's quite a long time, 6 to 10 minutes, where someone's not going to walk into the room. Someone's not going to hear a child screaming against the pillow, whatever it is. The other child's not going to wake up and hear that happening in the next room, all this kind of thing. In any way, so my position in this last chapter of the first narrative was that the two little girls were killed long before their mother. If you analyze Watts' tailoring of events, he used the baby monitor to place him outside of the crime scene. He does this because he knows where the children died. So he's basically saying where the children died, he wasn't. He wasn't in the same room. And now this is the area where, and I had someone on YouTube attack me in a really sort of vicious way, saying that there's no place in true crime for being imaginative. There's no place in true crime for fiction, I think was her words. She was saying when you dramatize something, you are embellishing, and you're turning something that is very sober, a crime, the death of people, you're turning that into speculation or entertainment or something. That's somebody who has no comprehension of what true crime rocket science is about whatsoever. I think someone who thinks like that is someone who is right in the sense that if you're in a courtroom and you're a lawyer, then you can only make statements that you can prove, right? And that's certainly very true, and that's a fact of true crime. In a situation where we don't have the answers, in other words, where someone is giving us a version that's not true, and then they give us another version that's not true either, then what are we left to do? Do we just say, well, their version is not true, so what really happened is I don't know? That's no good. So as a rebuttal to that, I just want to mention two things. I've sat in court cases, and I've sat there where you've heard the whole nonsense spiel of the murderer. You've heard him making up his fiction, and that's literally what it is. He makes up lies. So in the Henry van Bedell case, which was a triple axe murder, he talks about two phantom axe murderers coming in the scene and axing his family to death, and he simply sort of stands there while it happens, and nothing happens around him. And then his family gets sort of axed to death, but the axe murderer sort of just ignores him or isn't able to be very effective with the axe on him, and Henry's able to easily disarm him. That's a fiction, but that's what the court has spent weeks and weeks debunking and analyzing and criticizing and all that kind of thing. And what you find then is at the end of the trial, the judge finds the accused, and that's what he's referred to in South Africa, he finds the accused guilty, and then he provides a scenario. In other words, the judge provides a scenario which the accused hasn't, and the accused is referred to as the defendant in America. So in lieu of a crime taking place where the perpetrator lies about what actually happened, you have a big gap, and in that gap you have the end result, which is that people are dead and there's blood lying all over the place, but then you don't have the explanation for what actually happened. And what you often find, and what you found in that case, is the judge then narrates what likely happened in lieu of the absence of the narrative from anyone else, especially from the perpetrator. You can't then say that the judge is making a fiction. The judge is putting together a narrative that makes sense given all the information. That is exactly what true crime rocket science does. And you can make the argument and say, well, I don't think that narrative is true. And you can make the argument that I don't think that narrative makes sense. And that's why in court cases there are appeals. That's exactly what the murderers say. They say, that doesn't make sense. There's a lot of evidence about X, Y, and Z. But. Anyone can make the argument. It's actually very hard to make a credible spiel where that resonates and that adds up. And of course, if you don't know or care about the identity of the perpetrator and you don't know the facts of the case, you think you do, you think you know everything, but when you read these or you listen to these scenarios when they don't make much sense, it's probably because you don't know much about the case. Another example is Oscar Pistorius. The problem there was that the prosecution didn't do this. The prosecution didn't provide a motive and didn't provide a timeline. The defense did, and the timeline was incomplete, but it was better than what the prosecution didn't provide. What the prosecution did in the Oscar Pistorius case was they debunked all the little things, they criticized all the little pieces of evidence, but it left the judge with in the position of, okay, it looks like he did it, but you haven't given me a reason why. And the law doesn't require that. The law doesn't require that you give a motive. The law requires that you show intention. And the prosecution felt that they did that in the Oscar Pistorius case. It's a very interesting case in the sense that the judge wanted to know why, and I think that was important to address. Why also goes into that whole area where you can say, well, is that conjecture, is it fiction, or are you talking about something that's anchored in someone's identity? Anyone is free to read any rocket science blog or any rocket science book and say, oh, this is crap, I don't believe any of it. You're free to do that, you're free to disagree. There are a lot of people who will read each book and each series and say, wow, this actually is very compelling. This is based on the research, this is based on human psychology, this is based on what's been true in other cases, this is all anchored in common sense. This makes sense, that makes sense, that makes sense. So yes, there are a lot of people who think it's ludicrous, and then but there are also a lot of people who think it's not. And I think as long as there are people who support rocket science, I'll continue doing what we're doing. So in terms of the Watts case, we were talking about how the children were killed, and this is again where we look at the psychology of the killer and the evidence and what's in the discovery. And again, one can say, you're not very good at selecting this, it actually doesn't make sense. You can say that, but then come up with a better scenario. So this is the position of true crime rocket science, and that is Watts maybe harbored ill will or even hatred towards his wife, but it's doubtful that he felt a similar degree of ire towards his own children. And what this means is, if he did kill his own daughters, and the reason why it was put that way was at that stage there hadn't been a trial, the discovery hadn't been released, and his own position was that he hadn't. So at the time, early September 2018, one had to be careful saying something that hadn't been proven in court. So the point was, if he had killed his own daughters, he wouldn't wish to make it more unpleasant for them or for himself than it needed to be. In a lot of the sort of cacophony of people screaming and wailing and arguing about this case. They sort of get caught up in how Chris Watts is a monster and he's evil and he's a narcissist and he's a psychopath and all those things. As soon as you do that, you put him in a box and you don't need to do anything more. You don't need to look at what's in the box, because you know what's in the box. What's in the box is a psychopath. So as soon as you do that, then you actually separate the case from yourself, and you give yourself permission to not think about it. That's not what rocket science is about, and that's why we don't like labels. When we think about the criminals, we're not humanizing them, we're not sympathizing with them, and we're not in our effort to understand why crime happened, we're not trying to understand the criminal as if we want to give them a hug and sympathize with them. We're simply trying to understand how something happened, how something took place, and took place within the scenario, that within the crime it made sense. Not that, oh, I'm sitting here and now I'm going to commit murder because that also makes sense to me. You know, the fact that one's even got to make these statements is like true crime kindergarten 101. You know, everyone should know by now that true crime is about understanding why crimes happen. It's not justifying crimes, really. I think it's enough that we have to make these statements that are so obvious, really. So when you don't put Chris Watts in a box and you think of him as a person and as a father and as a person who does actually have emotions, then you have to wonder, you know, how would he have preferred to do something that he probably didn't want to do? How would he have preferred to kill his children? That's a horrible thing to say. It's a horrible thought, but one needs to think about it. And in my view, Casey Anthony sat with the same dilemma. She was acquitted of murdering her child, but one's got to at least consider the possibility that if she wanted to kill Kaylee, and I mean that's what the court case was all about, did she want to kill Kaylee or not? Was Kaylee's death on purpose or by accident? But if you're saying that it was on purpose, you say if she wanted to kill Kaylee, how would she do it without hurting her, without her suffering needlessly? And this may seem like a very strange thing to even be talking about, because surely when you murder someone, you're hurting them. Surely when you murder, you are causing pain. So this whole idea of this whole thought experiment, if you want to call it, this sounds nonsensical. You know why it's nonsensical? Because you don't care about the person committing the crime or the victim. You're simply projecting yourself and your own bias onto the crime. And it's this shallow attitude that is why people talk about these cases forever, and they never understand them because they never get past themselves. They never get past transferring their own bias onto these cases. It's something that we keep harping on rocket science, and most people just don't get it. Most people seem to, if you even say to them, hey, stop seeing yourself in the situation, try and see the people, let the people speak for themselves, let the events of the case speak to you. People don't seem to know what that means. They don't seem to know how to not insert themselves, put themselves on top of the people involved. So what you're talking about here is in a case where a child is being deliberately killed, but it's nothing personal, as strange and weird as that sounds. How would one go about that? And in the Casey Anthony case, there is also the googling of foolproof suffocation and the concocting of chloroform. Now, I don't want to discuss whether Casey Anthony is guilty or not, and I don't want to discuss whether her mother Googled that or not. I simply want to discuss the idea of a parent potentially Googling something like foolproof suffocation and why they would do that. And the answer is because I don't want my child to suffer. I don't want when I kill her to be a botched suffocation. I don't want to go through the trauma of messing this up, and I don't want the victim, I don't want my child to go through this. And I realize speaking about it in these almost casual terms makes it sound as if it's normal. It's not. I'm simply talking in the language of the crime that we're talking about. I'm certainly not trying to normalize it. I'm trying to understand what method one would use in this particular scenario, and I'm using another scenario to refer to it. So what we're looking at is an idea of murder that is as painless but quick and effective as possible. And I want to be clear that this is differentiating this kind of crime from a sadistic crime. So if you look at the murder of Kelsey, is it Brenneth, the Patrick Frazee case, where she was bludgeoned with seemed like a baseball bat. That's a sadistic crime where someone wants to hurt someone else and someone wants the other person to suffer, right? You have a crime like that, and you can also have a crime where someone doesn't want someone else to suffer. They want them to die. They want them out of their lives. They want their lives to be different, but they don't actually want to hurt somebody else, even though murder is hurting. I don't know if that makes sense. So, it may seem a contradiction in terms to kill someone and not want them to suffer, but people do it all the time when they put down their pets. They mean to kill them, but they mean to do so without adding to their suffering. And you may think that doesn't apply to true crime, but it does. And I think it applies to the Watts case. Again, I guess one's got to tip the hat to those who ridicule the notion of colorful language and say, yes, just as lie detecting is a pseudoscience, considered a pseudoscience, even the study of hair analysis is regarded as a pseudoscience. It nevertheless has application. I mean, the police do lie detector tests not because they're useful in court, but because they inform them of something. A lie detector test at least gives yet another version of events, and it, through the lie detector test, one gets to know your perpetrator or your suspect better. You get to see how confident they are. You get to see how unconfident they are. You get to confront them with what appears to be evidence of deceit and see how they respond. You get to break them down or see that they are actually telling the truth, whatever the case may be. So, some people ridicule this idea of colorful language. So to one person a word means something, and to another it's a completely obvious word. So, in terms of this particular area, the colorful language literally refers to a color, and it's the color blue. Colorful language reveals psychological leaks, pictures and images that only the killer knows and wants to share, but for reasons of self-preservation he can't. Like handwriting analysis, polygraph tests, and body language analysis, as I've said, it's not an exact science. It may or it may not point to something, but since it may point to something, it's worth being open to the possibility of what that might be. So even when we see colorful language, we're not saying it's absolutely pointing to something. We're saying it looks like it could be pointing to something. That's all we're saying. And so in Watts' version of events, the older child is scheduled to be killed first. And this is actually something that holds true in the first two confessions. Irrespective of who kills Bella, whether it is Chris or Shan'ann, the older child dies first, then the younger child, and then the youngest when Shan'ann is killed. Watts may have sedated the children. He may even have sedated Shan'ann before she left on her trip. So these were words I actually used in the very first narrative in the very last chapter, that the children were sedated as a means to murder them, and also that Shan'ann may have been sedated before she left on her trip. I don't think I expressed that very well. Not that she was sedated, but that she was, something was put in her formula or in her food or something, and not that she was sedated, but something was added to her food that could have made her ill. What's also worth noting is in the latest version of events, it implies that Shan'ann was poisoned or given this oxycodone when she was in North Carolina, when Watts arrived there. But we also have a second instance, possible instance. Nicole Utoft Atkinson said Shan'ann didn't feel well while she was away, while they were away together. So that's a second instance where Shan'ann seemed really not well. One can conflate that with her concerns about him having an affair, but I don't see why there would only be one attempt. Why wouldn't there be a second attempt? In fact, one could even argue that if Watts had succeeded in bringing about a miscarriage, then it wouldn't have been necessary to commit any of the other murders. So one can actually see there being a reason to make a few attempts because he didn't want to do the more extreme thing. Again, you can dismiss that, but Lacey Peterson also complained of extreme exhaustion just prior to a murder. And then again, you'll have a lot of people saying, well, that's a classic symptom of pregnancy. But if you're someone who's a silver fox and you want to hide your deceit in things that would appear that way anyway, then that's the way to go. Is by poisoning someone, you're going to have the same symptoms of fatigue and dizziness and so on as the symptoms of pregnancy itself. So I don't think one should be too naive in terms of thinking how the murderer would think in these circumstances. Which is why I say, while these circumstances could be explained by the ordinary experience of pregnancy, given what happened to these pregnant women, the notion shouldn't be discounted. So just to wrap up, the pertinent colorful language here actually involves a color, blue. We also know that Watts refers to his home being a ghost town, which suggests silver and blue, and corpses lying around for an extended period, becoming smelly and giving the sense of ghosts and haunted unease. Watts describes Bella's death not only in terms of her pallor, which he observed when he transported her body, but also of her being sprawled afterwards on her bed. The word can mean face down or lying for an extended period with hands and legs where they would not normally be and not moving. But the part where Watts catches himself out is when he describes the color of his children based on what he saw on the baby monitor. Now you can't tell the color on the baby monitor, and so we know that part's not true. He didn't see them on the baby monitor, but probably what he did see is that his children were blue, and I believe that version. I believe that his children were blue, and I believe that they were blue inside the home. And what that means is if they were overdosed, then how he would recognize that they were no longer alive would be probably firstly the change in color, the pallor in their faces, and then secondly, which would be something he would probably be less inclined to want to do, but the confirmation that they weren't breathing and that there wasn't a pulse. So you wouldn't probably even need to check breathing or pulse if it was clear from the pallor that they changed color and that they were no longer alive. So one could see it and even smell it. One wouldn't necessarily have to check for signs of life. And so as soon as you have that discussion, turning blue would require quite a lot of time. And in what's the scenario, he talks, this is in terms of the first confession, he talks about Shan'ann has just strangled the children and they've already turned blue. Well, they don't. You don't turn blue immediately. It takes a while for the blood to drain and for that pellet to happen. So so that's the scenario. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to this channel, click the bell and leave a comment. At the moment I'm working on a narrative based on the third confession. Obviously the book with the letters hasn't been released, but I'm not basing it on that. I'm basing it on the letter that was published in the media and just looking at that letter compared to what he has said in the past. What lines up, what makes sense, and where does this new information ultimately take us, if anywhere. And that should be available earlier than, I didn't expect this release to take place before the book was published. Since it has been, I will be able to move up my statement analysis by about a week or so. So you can expect Silver Fox to come out sometime in October, before the end of the month. It'll be a short analysis based on some of the information that's been released in the media and some information that's been communicated directly to me. I'm not going to say by who or through whom, but I think it's going to be quite a shock as well to a lot.